All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into some really fascinating ancient philosophical logic to figure out how we actually communicate and perceive the world around us. I mean, we use language every single day, right? Usually without a second thought. But have you ever stopped to wonder how a random sound that just comes out of your mouth actually connects to the physical, tangible world? Well, in this explainer, we're going to break down the actual mechanics of meaning itself.
To get to the bottom of this, we've got a pretty clear roadmap. First, we'll look at the 4 types of dimensions. Second, the word-object paradox. Third, the speech catalyst. Fourth, we'll get into memory and mistakes. And finally, substance versus size. So let's kick things off with Section 1, the 4 types of dimensions, or types of paramana.
According to this classical framework, the absolute foundation of how we interact with objects is through measurement. They call this parimana, and the text breaks this down into 4 fundamental categories. You've got anu, which basically means minute or atomic. Then there's mahat, meaning large, think like a mountain. Dirga, which is long. And finally hrasva, which is short. Basically, every physical thing we perceive is anchored by these basic measurements. They're literally the building blocks of physical reality.
Moving right along to Section 2, the word-object paradox and the disconnect in meaning. Now, here's the central Socratic debate that's really at the heart of our explainer. If a word is fundamentally not the physical object itself, how on earth does it establish any meaning? Seriously, think about the massive disconnect here between the invisible, fleeting sounds we make when we speak and the very tangible, physical world we're trying to describe. How does a mere vibration in the air somehow conjure up an entire, complex object in the listener's mind?
The source text brings up this brilliantly absurd point to show how crazy it is to assume words and objects are the exact same thing. Think about it. If the word was literally identical to the object, then simply saying the word food out loud would magically fill up your stomach. Or even crazier, saying the word sword would actually cut your mouth. The text uses this wild logic, even pointing out that saying fire would burn your tongue, to playfully but very firmly prove that words are absolutely not the physical things they represent.
Okay, so if a word isn't the object, then what exactly is it? Well, the skeptical view argues that words are purely mechanical. They're basically just wind from the body striking the throat and the vocal cords. It's just physical friction born from a biological mechanism and nothing more. But if words are really just biological wind, how do they convey any sort of truth?
That brings us to Section 3, the speech catalyst and the role of intention.
And here is the missing link. It's a concept called vivaksha. Vivaksha is defined as the speaker's core intention, or their really deep-seated desire to communicate a specific meaning. You can think of it as this invisible psychological bridge between a mere mechanical sound happening in your throat and a meaningful word that somebody else can actually understand.
So let's ask ourselves a really critical question here to see why this is a logical necessity. If words were just physical throat friction entirely devoid of any internal intention, what would human communication even look like? Well, comparing physical speech without intention to speech guided by intention gives us a pretty stark contrast. Without vivakasha, without that intent, all human speech would just instantly devolve into senseless noise. Actually, the text literally compares it to the babble of a madman. Intention is the absolutely vital ingredient that organizes that random wind in your throat into an actual vehicle for human connection.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, memory and mistakes, what happens when systems break down.
Now, this brings up a massive challenge from the skeptic. If intention strictly requires genuinely experiencing the object you're talking about, how does a deceiver intentionally speak about something that simply isn't true? Like, if they aren't experiencing the truth, how can they possibly possess the intention to speak it? To clear this up, the source text addresses 2 distinct anomalies, the deceiver and the confused person. When someone is lying, the deceiver relies on a memory of past objects or experiences to fake their intent. They're basically pulling from the past to construct a lie in the present. And what about the confused person? Well, the text notes they have this faint, almost accidental intention. It compares it to walking down a path and unknowingly brushing against a blade of grass. You didn't actively intend to focus on it, but that super faint physical perception still sparked a sudden, fuzzy intention. So you see, even anomalies rely on some thread of intention in memory.
All of this creates a step-by-step cognitive chain linking the human mind to spoken reality. Step 1, past experience, or anubhava. Step 2, memory, smarana. Step 3, that intention to speak, vivaksha. Step 4, the physical action of the vocal cords. And finally, Step 5,
the spoken word itself, shabda. So you can clearly see the journey here from a thought all the way to a physical sound. You simply cannot jump to the spoken word without passing through the rest of that chain.
To kind of summarize this whole linguistic debate, the text emphasizes that if words didn't have this causal chain connecting them all the way back to genuine experience, listeners would only ever hear a speaker's bare intent, not any objective truth about the world. And with that connection to reality, the very concepts of winning or losing a debate would just completely collapse. The whole thing would just be a chaotic battle of subjective noises.
All right, on to our final stop, Section 5, Substance versus Size and Physical Perception.
Here's the skeptic's final argument for us to tackle. Are an object's physical substance, its dravya, and its dimension, its parimana, exactly the same thing? You see, the skeptic assumes that because you can never truly know a physical object without it having some kind of size, substance and size must be completely identical.
Let's systematically dismantle that misconception right now. Perceiving the substance, which really just means identifying what the actual object is fundamentally different from perceiving its dimension, which is gauging how big it actually is. Yes, they're tightly linked in reality, obviously, but they are absolutely not the same cognitive event in our minds. To prove this, the text anchors the philosophy in a super relatable human experience. You can see a massive substance from far away, say a huge mountain or a distant skyscraper, but you can completely misjudge its dimension. From a great distance, a really big thing looks incredibly small. You know exactly what it is, so you definitely understand its substance, but your eyes completely fail at judging how big it is. This brilliantly proves that our senses process substance and dimension entirely differently. So, I want you to think about the last time you grossly misjudged the size of a distant object. Did your eyes deceive your understanding of reality? Or does your mind just have to work overtime to piece together the dimensions, the words, and the complex intentions of the world around you? It's kind of like a giant puzzle. Keep questioning your perceptions, stay curious out there, and thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.